Hello and welcome to the latest edition of the Federalist Files. We will be going over Federalist number 20. It's titled The Same Subject Continued, The Inefficiency of the Present Confederation to Preserve the Union, written by James Madison, December 11th, 1787. Topics include positive versus negative powers and encroachments during exigencies. So just to clear some things up, I've been looking online, I've been trying to figure out these last three papers. It says, according to some sources, it was written by Madison and Hamilton. Some sources just say Madison. So I just want to clear that up for anybody that is interested in that. Now, this paper, again, Madison, and it's going to be the last paper, I think, where they go through another History 101 lesson. In particular, they're looking at the United Netherlands in this one, also known as the Dutch Republic, but they call it the United Netherlands. So in this paper, Madison, again, he reflects on the failings of another confederacy. He cites the United Netherlands, where the executive magistrate is this, they call it a stateholder. And at the time, a position held by a hereditary prince. So what's interesting about this is I've looked up a lot of the information, trying to figure out exactly what was going on. I was trying to discern it. It seems like it started as you had your they called it the States General, and that was their version of an assembly, kind of like the Congress assembled. And they had the same issue that the current Articles of Confederation at the time had, where the power of the federal government only extended to the sovereigns of those states. But what was also weird about it, and they call it, he refers to it as an aristocracy, but what doesn't really make sense about it is the sovereigns or the stateholder was just one guy, but to begin the republic years beforehand in the 1500s, it was multiple stateholders, and then eventually, I think they're called the Orange Party, took over, and then that person ended up taking over really everything, all the different provinces. I think there's 7 of them, from what I understand. It was the Prince of Orange is what they call it. And then what's really funny about this is at the time when they're writing it, it is 1787, but the Dutch, they called it the Dutch Republic. They had almost like a revolution at this time, from 1780 to 1787. William V was considered the stateholder, Prince of Orange, and his supporters were called Orangists. It just seems like a giant aristocracy in the way in which they explain it. But just a little information, a little background. They had kind of like a civil war, not a civil war, more like a revolutionary war. And they were freeing up a lot of these Dutch cities and municipalities and local government and these militias. And they were organizing, and they gained power of Dutch cities, where they replaced the old system with a new system of democratically elected representatives. So what it seems like to me is that they had this stateholder, William V, and he was placing people in these municipalities of power, and they were, Orangists, or rather his supporters. And then from there was the revolution, where they took a lot of those supporters out, and they put their own democratically elected representatives in place. So obviously there's a lot of anarchy going on at this time because their constitution was ineffective, or rather, I'll go over it, but they were not abiding by their constitution, which makes it relevant today because it seems like we're not abiding by our constitution either. So it's so funny how these things come back to, they end up being relevant in today's times, because currently we are not, with the situation in Pennsylvania as well as Texas suing Pennsylvania, we're not abiding by our own constitution, and it seems like no one cares, and there's nothing being done by the bureaucracy, there's nothing being done by GOP, only a very select few GOP politicians, and most conservative, I would say, podcast hosts are attempting to do something about it, but it seems like the GOP, the establishment GOP in and of itself, is a dead body right now. They are enigmatic. They are lifeless. They're doing nothing. So what happened was this revolution, this helped to emasculate the stateholder's power. So William V, they emasculated his power. He was deprived of command over his large part of the Dutch state's army. And what they did was, because they were able to take out these different supporters in these provinces, and all these, they called it a patrioton. That's what it was called, and it meant time of the patriots. That was this revolution, and then eventually they were defeated by a Prussian army, these revolutionaries, and many of them were forced into exile. And then I think it was 1795, which was after all of this, after the Constitution was being written and proposed. I think they ended up disbanding the Dutch Republic. I don't remember the name exactly of the deal that they went through with to get rid of that republic, and then they called it something else, and now what it is totally different. And I don't know if I could find it here. I'm trying to. Yeah, I'm not exactly sure. There's so much information historically, because these republics will go on for years. They'd go on for, it started in like 1544. so it goes on for 300 years. They have a couple mentions of some of the stuff that happened in the before chapters, these different treaties. Yeah, so I don't have, I know it's 1795 where they disbanded the republic, or the the Dutch Republic, but I don't have exactly what it was called. There was some sort of a war or something where they disbanded. But so now Madison starts off here. That's just a little background information so you can better understand what's going on, what I'm talking about here. So he starts off by stating, and I quote, "The Union is composed of 7 co-equal and sovereign states, and each state or province is a composition of equal and independent cities. In all important cases, not only the provinces but the cities must be unanimous." So, end quote. So this is the thing, really, that this is the downfall more than anything of this republic. This is why this republic, this confederacy did not work out. It's the unanimous vote. So if you wanted to amend their constitution, you would need everyone in complete agreement, which was not possible at this time. And it really set an unrealistic expectation, because if you need complete unanimity, you need everyone to vote on it. It's just not going to happen. And then when it doesn't happen, then maybe you're going to subvert that constitution and usurp your power just to get something done that you find something that needs to be mandatorily done. It's like, for example, if we got attacked on Pearl Harbor and we wanted to declare war in Japan, and let's say we need a unanimous vote, and we were unable to get that unanimous vote, are we just not, now we're just going to lay here and wait for Germany and Japan to take us over? Our government would have probably still declared war anyway. And that's the problem with setting a unanimous vote, because it really is there's no safeguard on that unanimous vote. You can just have one out of, at that time, I don't know if we were 50 states. I want to say Hawaii was added like in the 50s. Maybe I'm wrong, but let's say we're 48 states, because I think Alaska was added later too. Let's say we're 48 states. You need all 48 states to be in complete agreement in order to declare war on this other country, which is it's just unrealistic. It's a impractical proposition. So then he continues, and I quote, "The sovereignty of the Union is represented by the States General, consisting usually of about 50 deputies appointed by the provinces. They hold their seats, some for life, some for 6, 3, and 1 years. From 2 provinces, they continue an appointment during pleasure," end quote. So this is another problem with their system, is there was no uniformity in how long these, they called them deputies, would be in the States General. And like I said, the States General was their version of a Congress or an assembly. It was kind of like how we had our Articles of Confederation. We called it the Congress Assembled. That was their version of the Congress Assembled. But like I said, there's no uniformity with this system. Certain provinces the way it worked is you held your seat for life. In certain provinces it's 6 or 3 or 1 year, and then some it's you continue during pleasure as you almost. This is kind of how our judicial system works in the Supreme Court. You hold your position until you want to step down from it. It's a life appointment, essentially. So then he continues, and I quote, "The States General have authority to enter into treaties and alliances, to make war and peace, to raise armies and equip fleets, to ascertain quotas and demand contributions. In all these cases, however, unanimity and the sanction of their constituents are requisite. They have authority to appoint and receive ambassadors, to execute treaties and alliances already formed, to provide for the collection of duties on imports and exports, to regulate the mint with a saving to the provincial rights, to govern as sovereigns the dependent territories. The provinces are restrained unless with the general consent from entering into foreign treaties, from establishing imposts injurious to others, or charging their neighbors with higher duties than their own subjects. A council of state, a chamber of accounts with 5 colleges of admiralty, aid and fortify the federal administration. End quote. It was interesting. So the States General, there's a lot of similarities to the Articles of Confederation, the powers in which they had, but it seems like still there is no apparatus or structure in order to enforce it. So that's why Madison is drawing the comparison here. So they can raise their armies, they can equip fleets. When it says ascertain quotas and demand contributions, that's taxation. You could say, hey, this is the quota, you have to pay 3%, every single across the all the provinces, you guys have to pay this. But there really is no way to set it up, and then they don't set any judicial system up either to deal with people that do not they violate the Constitution and not paying that quota. And like I said, the reach expands out to the provinces. It doesn't expand the objects of this States General Assembly, the objects of this Constitution. It was the same thing as the Articles of Confederation. It did not extend to the people. It just extended to the states individually. And that's what the main issue is. And it's also that it seems like there's a lot of written power to a States General. But the biggest problem is it's the unanimity clause here saying everyone has to agree. Everyone has to be in agreement. So you can regulate the mint. You can do this. You can do that. And when they say regulate the mint, they're just talking about the coin. Essentially, you can regulate the currency, whatever the currency is. But it seems like here, which is different, is you can regulate the currency with a saving to the provincial rights, so each province could have its different set currency, which is not good. That's much less of a federal system, and it's more of a, like I said, a confederacy. It's not a union. There's nothing really uniform about that one provision there in particular. And the provinces, like you said, they were unrestrained. They can enter into foreign treaties, but you would need the general consent of all the other provinces. And then at that point, if you're getting the general consent of all the provinces, you might as well just make it straight across the board, everyone having the same treaty. That's why it doesn't really make any sense. This unanimity clause is really what kills this Constitution, because it sets an unrealistic standard that can easily be circumvented just because it's so unrealistic. And then once you circumvent that, it's a slippery slope. Once you circumvent that one provision of unanimity, then at that point, what stops you from just doing anything? Because once you violate the Constitution once or twice, then at that point, once you violate the Constitution even once, then you can just violate it as much as you want, because then you can point back and say, hey, look, we violated that one time, let's just continue to do it. And especially when there's no court, forget it. If there's no Supreme Court or court system to really handle it in the courts and try to rectify the issue, then it's just going to continue, it's going to perpetuate. So then next he has... Next, he states, then he explains the hereditary prince. They call him the Stateholdr. He has excessive powers in relation to holding an army. That's actually probably his biggest power is his military strength, which would enforce taxes at the end of a bayonet. I don't know exactly because he talks about this, and I don't know exactly if it's necessarily the hereditary prince, like the Stateholdr, or if it's or if it's more the General Assembly. It seems like it's more the States General, that the Assembly, that's really taxing you at the end of the bayonet. Now, the hereditary prince is kind of setting the standard, like, hey, this is how much we need, because he also, this hereditary prince, he gets involved in the States General. That's why it's kind of weird, because you have the States General that's kind of like a legislative body, but then you have the executive, who is the hereditary prince, getting involved in that body, and they really should not be in terms of taxation and all that. And then the enforcement of it could be by him, because technically, if you think about our country, we have the IRS that's under the executive branch. The executive branch is in charge of enforcing the laws. The legislative branch makes the laws, and then the judicial branch interprets the laws. So I guess that taxes at the end of the bayonet could be coming from the hereditary prince, but at the same time, this assembly, they can set these unrealistic standards in terms of the taxation, which just is not going to be able to be done. So settling another power he has is settling intra-conflicts between the provinces, the ability to appoint town magistrates. See, that's the biggest thing is he has the power, this unfettered power to appoint town magistrates. So he executes provincial decrees, thorough power of pardon. So pretty much he can pardon for anything, even treason, which you can't do. The president in the United States cannot. He can only pardon for regular crimes, but if anything that's related to treason or related to his own impeachment, they're not able to pardon for. Now, making treaties and many more powers that should be spread throughout a legislature and a judicature. Yeah, he had a lot of power. The appointing of town magistrates that's odd. That would be like our president being able to appoint governors and mayors of towns, which is so it was a real top-down structure in terms of the executive branch. There wasn't a lot of democracy going on. There were not people voting for who they wanted. But at the same time, him having this power, this stateholder, and Madison goes on to explain this actually does cause a little bit more stability than there would be, considering the States General had such odd powers, and there was a lot of factions because of the way in which their unanimity and them overstepping their boundaries. So it was like you had a lot of power on the States General side that was written on paper, and they would usurp the unanimity clause, which would be tyrannical, and they would abuse their power. But then also a safeguard on that was having that hereditary prince who was able to. But here's the problem: the people are going to be living in oppression because they have two different branches of the government overstepping their bounds. But they're both battling each other. It seems like, from what I understand, and like I said, there's no real judicial branch. Like I said, this hereditary prince, he had power that should have been laid in the legislature and in the judicial branch if there was one. Now, this is about the military power that he holds, this prince, and I quote, "In his military capacity, he commands the federal troops, provides for garrisons, and in general regulates military affairs, disposes of all appointments from colonels to ensigns and of the government and posts of fortified towns. In his marine capacity, he is admiral general and superintends and directs everything relative to naval force and other naval affairs, presides in the admiralties in person or by proxy, appoints lieutenant admirals and other officers, and establishes councils of war whose sentences are not executed till he approves them." End quote. So that's really complete and utter power over the military in every single way, shape, and facet, essentially. And I think he can completely declare war himself too, unless if that was something that was given to the States General, from what it seems like. See, that's the thing that's weird, because the States General had their power to raise armies and equip fleets, but then he also had his power as well to do the same. I guess that power was within their individual provinces. They had the power to really create militias, but he had 40,000. From what I read, they actually write it in the Federalist Papers. He had 40,000 of his own soldiers, and that's why it was his power versus these provincial powers. And he really had he appointed everybody that was in the military, so everyone had their loyalty to him, and rather they did not have the loyalty to the people like they should have. So then Madison continues, and I quote, "It was long ago remarked by Grotius that nothing but the hatred of his countrymen to the House of Austria kept them from being ruined by the vices of their constitution. The Union of Utrecht," says another respectable writer, "reposes an authority in the States General seemingly sufficient to secure harmony, but the jealousy in each province renders the practice very different from the theory." End quote. So the Union of Utrecht, should begin with, that was everyone combining in the Republic. I don't remember what year it was exactly. I do have it here, I think. if I could find it, the Treaty of Utrecht in 1713 under Frederick William I of Prussia ceded the Principality of Orange to King Louis the 14th. In 1732, the Treaty of Partition agreed to share use of title Prince of Orange with Frederick William the First of Prussia with the emergence of the kingdom. So it seems like to me it was just the Kingdom of the Netherlands, along with some of the Dutch monarch, they kind of just combined into one from what it seems like. But the thing that you would think through this union is essentially what this historian, I mean, Grotius, they're referring to Hugo Grotius, and that guy was like a statesman. He was a scholar and a diplomat, and that was he died in 1645, so he's talking about something from hundreds of years ago, really. And that's when that Treaty of Utrecht was, I guess. No, Treaty of Utrecht was 1713, so I guess it was before that he's even talking about. That's what it looks like. The Principality of Orange, which was in 1163. Forget it. So he's talking about a long time ago, really. He's saying that you would think that there would be able to secure harmony, peace, tranquility by all these powers that were invested in the States General. But in each province renders the practice very different from the theory. So depending on what province you're in, depending on how oppressive it is, how strong it is, how much money they have to pay those quotas, to pay taxation, it really depended upon that. So he continues here, Madison, and he states, and I quote, "The same instrument says another obliges each province to levy certain contributions, but this article never could and probably never will be executed because the inland provinces who have little commerce cannot pay an equal quota," end quote. So if the quota was you have to pay 3% or not even a percentage point, maybe it was, you have to pay $1,000 per resident. There were the smaller provinces with less money, very little commerce going on. They were unable to pay those contributions. And this is very similar to what was going on at the time of the Articles of Confederation. They had the same written down power where, they can request as many quotas or contributions as possible, but then there's really no way to enact it or to instill it or to enforce it. And that was the problem. Next, he goes on, he states, and I quote, "It has more than once happened that deficiencies had to be ultimately collected at the point of a bayonet, a thing practicable, though dreadful, in a confederacy where one of the members exceeds in force all the rest, and where several of them are too small to meditate resistance, but utterly impracticable in one composed of members, several of which are equal to each other in strength and resources, and equal singly to a vigorous and preserving defense," end quote. So really what he's saying is at the point, if there's no judicial system, there's no apparatus, there's no structure, they're going to have to collect revenue at the point of a bayonet by gun, by physical confiscatory force. And at this time, what he's saying is that there were smaller ones, and they can't mediate, they can't really do anything. They can't resist. They just kind of have to give up. And then he said several of which are equal to each other in strength and resource and equal singly to a vigorous and preserving defense. So there's a bunch of other states or rather provinces that just wouldn't pay it and they don't care, and they all have pretty much equal power, which is kind of a scary situation because it's chaotic where they can all really get into war at any time. Then he continues, and I quote, "In critical emergencies, the States General are often compelled to overlap their constitutional bounds. In 1688, they concluded a treaty of themselves at the risk of their heads, the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648, by which their independence was formally and finally recognized, was concluded without the consent of Zealand. Even as recently as the last treaty of peace with Great Britain, the constitutional principle of unanimity was departed from. A weak constitution must necessarily terminate in dissolution for want of proper powers or the usurpation of powers requisite for the public safety. Whether the usurpation, when once begun, will stop at the salutary point or go forward to the dangerous extreme must depend on the contingencies of the moment," end quote. So the argument he's making here, and if you notice, there's some familiar names, the Treaty of Westphalia, and then the Treaty of Peace. So I've mentioned this before, is the Dutch Republic, the Treaty of Peace. I think they got some of the southern parts of South America, like the Caribbean islands. I think they got some of that in that treaty, and that was the treaty between the United States, Spain, Britain, and I think the Dutch Republic. I think those are all the names that were included. Maybe France was. I think France was in there as well. And like I said, the Treaty of Westphalia actually increased the size of the Republic of, the Dutch Republic by 20%. And what he's saying is they didn't recognize the unanimity clause. So they did not get the consent of Zealand. I guess Zealand was one of the provinces. Makes sense because there's New Zealand. So I guess that's Old Zealand. You got Zealand. That was one of the provinces that did not agree to the Treaty of Westphalia. And then the last treaty, the peace treaty that he's alluding to as well, the unanimity clause was also departed from. They did not hold that clause. So he's saying a weak constitution like this, there's going to be a termination and dissolution. You're going to have a dissolution or a disunion of that republic because of it. And then and this is the most important part he says, is whether the usurpation, when once begun, will stop at the solitary point or go forward to the dangerous extreme must depend on the contingencies of the moment. So meaning they will usurp their power now at this point, since they've already done it before, and it's all going to be based on in proportionality to the contingencies, or rather the threat. It's going to be based on the threat or the threat. And that's really what's going on right now. What we're seeing is usurpations by the government, and they're not abiding by the Constitution, and it's all based off of the threat or exigencies, these disaster systems. And like I said, I've said this before, is the most important time to have the Constitution is in these chaotic times. It was made for this exact scenario. You don't need the Constitution when everything's going fine and well. You need it in the tumultuous times, in the chaotic times, and exigency scenarios and circumstances is when you need the Constitution to truly speak and show its power to the people. And that was not what was going on here. Whenever it was based on the magnitude of the exigency. That's how they would govern, which was illegal against the Constitution, and that's something that we're seeing ourselves in our own country. Difference here is we have a judicial system, and we go to the judicial branch when things are not covered or not followed in the Constitution. But right now, there's a dereliction of duty, especially in terms of the election. We are not seeing that being done by our judicial branch. We're not seeing the Supreme Court take any moves in which they should be taking cases up, especially when they're directly under the jurisdiction, like the Texas v. Pennsylvania scenario, where there's nowhere else. They can't even kick it down to a lower court because this is directly under the jurisdiction of the Supreme Court. So this is something that they're saying here in the Federalist Papers. They're saying this can end a weak Constitution. And let me say this clearly. Our Constitution is not weak. It is the people that are running the system. They are weak. The Constitution is not weak. It is the bureaucrats. It is the elected officials. They are the weak ones in the scenario. Our Constitution is perfectly fine. There's nothing wrong with it. It's always been a genius piece of governing document, the best in the history of man. Our problem right now is the people that are in the system, the people running the system. So then Madison, and in this scenario, they did not, their Constitution was legitimately actually weak on paper. There was not set systems or apparatuses to deal with these scenarios. Like I said, there was no judicial branch. So then Madison continues, and he states, and I quote, "Tyranny has perhaps oftener grown out of the assumptions of power called for on pressing exigencies by a defective constitution than out of the full exercise of the largest constitutional authorities," end quote. What he's saying here is tyranny really, it more often happens when circumstances are not covered by the Constitution, or these exigency scenarios, they do not have a Constitution set in place that is able to address these problems. For example, ours actually is everything that's going on. You're going to have the electors vote, or they voted already December 14th. Then it has to get validated by the legislature, I think it's the state legislatures by like January 10th, but it's the real vote actually happens until January 20th at 12 p.m. when the inauguration happens. That is up until the time in which the Trump team or his legal team can fight. And then once that happens, those electors go through with that vote, then whoever they end up voting for, that's the president. So we do have a set system. We have, and it's supposed to go through any issues that we have, should be going through court systems and the Supreme Court if they decide to take up a case with, thousands of affidavits, which are sworn testimony, which are considered evidence in a court of law if they were taken up. So what he's saying, Madison, here is when you don't have those set standards to address these problems, what you'll see is a usurpation of the power. They will overstep their bounds. They will infringe on the rights and violate the Constitution. Now, these excerpts hold an additional value that Madison may not have tried to present, but he subliminally achieved this. And this is what I say in the very beginning when I say what the topics are: positive versus negative powers. And I've gone over this before, but I'm going to hit it again just because I think it's important for this paper. It's also important in a general sense in explaining to your liberal friends what exactly the federal constitution means and what state constitutions as well mean, how the powers are supposed to be interpreted. So Madison demonstrates the concept that government is quick to overstep its boundaries when in an exigent circumstance and assumes power that is not instituted by a governing document. Power in this case is considered negative in terms of its allowance, meaning the point Madison is proving is that the government in the case provided takes that absence of provision as an allowance for them to partake in that unregistered and non-ratified power. So in the Constitution, some people, this is what, people like Andrew Cuomo believe. They could say, oh, well, there's no provision in the Constitution saying you don't have to wear a mask, so we can instill mask policy. That's considered a negative power by the government. That's not how it works. The Constitution works. It lays out the groundwork for positive powers. Everything that is written in that Constitution, it does give those powers to the government, but that's it. There's no extension of those powers. Those are the powers that are written on paper, and that's it. They're not supposed to extend past that, because then there's no set standard on what the power of the government is. It is anything you want it to be. And that is the reason they're not negative, because if you're going to cite powers as negative powers like that, then really we don't have any powers as citizens of the United States, because they're not all listed in the Constitution. And then on top of that, you would have a document that's thousands of pages long. So simply put, those powers that are written into the Constitution are positive powers, and the fact that there's not rights written in, with the exception of the Bill of Rights, there's no rights written in for the citizens. There's a reason for that, because the citizens' rights far exceed that of the government, so it's much easier to just write down what the government's powers are rather than write down all of the powers of the people, because if you're writing down the powers of the people, it would be thousands of pages. So the philosophy behind the Constitution is converse to these tyrannical principles, and the constitutional power are considered positive powers, meaning that the government can only act on powers that are granted in the Constitution agreed upon by the people. There's no negative powers where, it doesn't say the people don't have to wear a mask, so we can instill any mask policy we want. It's not the way it works. So then Madison continues, and I quote, "Notwithstanding the calamities produced by the stateholdership, it has been supposed that without his influence in the individual provinces, the causes of anarchy manifest in the Confederacy would long ago have dissolved it. Under such a government," says Abbe Mably, so we've seen that name before. That is, I think he was like a French philosopher, French historian. He states, "The Union could never be subsisted if the provinces had not a spring within themselves capable of quickening their tardiness and compelling them to the same way of thinking. This spring is the Stateholdr." End quote. So what he's saying is the only reason that there hasn't been a dissension amongst these provinces is actually because the Stateholdr almost has an equal power to this General Assembly. They have a lot, and this General Assembly continues to usurp their power, but the Stateholdr has a lot of power himself, so he's able to kind of keep everything together. He's able to kind of match the legislative branch, whereas usually in republics and confederacies, the legislative branch always ends up taking over everybody's power at the end of the day, because they have the power to make law, so they have the power to make more powers for the legislative branch, and that's really what the problem is of having a legislature and having a weak executive branch, and then on top of that, not having a judicial system to run through the laws. He continues on this note, Madison. He states, "These are not the only circumstances which have controlled the tendency to anarchy and dissolution. The surrounding powers impose an absolute necessity of union to a certain degree, at the same time that they nourish by their intrigues the constitutional vices which keep the republic in some degree always at their mercy." End quote. So here what he's saying is there's actually so many foreign influences, so much foreign power on the outside of this republic, that there's actually a need for unification in order for self-preservation and survival. And then he continues, and I quote, "The true patriots have long bewailed the fatal tendency of these vices, and have made no less than 4 regular experiments by extraordinary assemblies convened for the special purpose to apply a remedy. As many times has their laudable zeal found it impossible to unite the public councils in reforming the known, the acknowledged, the fatal evils of the existing constitution." End quote. So here what he's saying is they tried to do exactly what America did when they got together and they had the Constitutional Convention, and they tried to rewrite the Constitution or amend it, but it was unable to be done because there has to be, and they did this 4 different times. It's unable to be done because there's a clause in there that of unanimity. You need everyone to agree upon it across the board, and that was not the case for the proposed Constitution. It was 9 out of the 13 colonies, or rather 9 out of the 13 states had to agree, and then that was those 9 states were all considered under the Constitution, and then they eventually over time got the other 4, and then they kept adding, more and more territories, and now we have 50 states. Here with this system, their current system, is you needed everybody straight across the board to agree on it, and that just was not going to happen. And this was not only, the crazier part about it is, I don't know if I actually mentioned this, but not only did those provinces have to agree, but all of the local governments also had to be in agreement. Whereas here, if you want to amend the Constitution, you got 2/3 of the Congress, so you need 2/3 from the legislative branch, meaning the Senate and the House of Representatives, 2/3 of both of those chambers. And then on top of that, you have to go through the state, each individual state's legislature. You need 3/4 of the states with a majority vote. So you need, let's say, I think it's like 38. You need 38 states in agreement to pass or amend the Constitution, but you don't need a complete across the board unanimous vote, because then it will just never happen. There won't be amendments. Now, then he goes on to state, and I quote, "The first wish prompted by humanity is that a severe trial may issue in such a revolution of their government as will establish their union and render it the parent of tranquility, freedom, and happiness. The next, that the asylum under which we trust the enjoyment of these blessings will speedily be secured in this country may receive and console them for the catastrophe of their own." Pretty much what Madison's saying is, hey, this is kind of the come together moment. Everybody come together. We need to establish this union with tranquility, freedom, and happiness, and we will almost avenge the system that's going on, the republic that's going on in the Dutch Republic over in Europe, the catastrophe, and we will try to console them with showing them how it's done with our government. And he concludes this paper. Or no, I got one more after this, but he states, and I quote, "I make no apology for having dwelt so long on the contemplation of these federal precedents. Experience is the oracle of truth, and where its responses are unequivocal, they ought to be conclusive and sacred." End quote. So here, essentially, what he's saying is, history is the source of reference, and it cannot be matched in its substance. This history, when consequences are so significant and unmatched, they ought to be considered as valid and remembered. Just, study history, understand what's going on, essentially, and use it in the future so you don't repeat the same mistake. And then this is where he ends here. A strong, powerful statement. He states, and I quote, "The important truth which it unequivocally pronounces in the present case is that a sovereignty over sovereigns, a government over governments, a legislation for communities as contradistinguished from individuals as it is a solecism in theory, so in practice it is subversive of the order and ends of civil polity by substituting violence in place of law or the destructive coercion of the sword in the place of mild and salutary coercion of the magistracy." End quote. Here what he's saying is, these sovereigns governing over sovereigns, meaning, you have your government that governs over your government rather than governing over the people. It is, in theory, erroneous, or solecism in theory, but in practice it's erroneous. So it sounds good in theory, but then when you try to practice it, people are subverting the law. They're avoiding these state governments are avoiding the law, and they're not enforcing the law that's given to them by the federal government. So this federal government needs to extend its purview over the people rather than over the individual state or province governments. And if you don't do this, it'll end in destruction, coercion by sword. So there'll be violence in order to enforce the laws and enforce those laws from the federal government. And that'll take the place of having a magistracy, meaning it'll take the place of having a judicial branch and being mild and salutary through the judicial system. Essentially, that's what he's trying to get across, and he's trying to get this across the last 3 papers. So the next one that we're going to be doing, what is it, Federalist number 21. It's going to be a different subject. It's going to really he's going to attempt to wrap up what's going on here and all of these other ones with more defects of the present Confederation. So that's it for this one. I appreciate everyone for tuning in. Please like, share, subscribe. The regular stuff, make sure you drop the mic. I am unable to advertise myself. So if this show really goes by my posts on Facebook as well as word of mouth, I need people to share it. I need people to like it, comment. Just do whatever you can. Subscribe on Rumble. Join me, follow me. I have about 850 on Rumble just because Rumble will go out of the way for me and they will advertise my podcast because I give them a certain exclusive rights to the video. Whereas YouTube tries to suppress all my content. YouTube sometimes it's on and off. YouTube will have, based on their algorithm, sometimes I'll have no views, and then sometimes I'll have 50 to 100 views on some of my videos. And all the content I'm generally covering the same thing other than when I go to my current event podcasts. So it doesn't really make any sense. So if you are going to follow me, I'd much appreciate if you followed me on YouTube as well as Rumble. But if you're going to listen to me regularly, I would appreciate it either podcast platform. Consistently I'm on Apple, I'm on iHeartRadio, I'm on Spotify, I'm pretty much everywhere. Either listen to me there or listen to me on Rumble. I don't really rely on YouTube for anything. They demonetize a lot of my videos. They give me a hard time over stupid copyright things that are not real copyright. They're all fair use and they're legal. But yeah, I greatly appreciate everyone for tuning in. I will see everyone on Friday. Thank you.